Today we're going to talk about the VFL Stage 2 dilemma. And the dilemma, if you haven't already made your team, is this. It's the fact that Pacific is playing 2 games, and they're going to get points for both of these games. Now, that in itself isn't a dilemma, because you would think, well, just pick a bunch of Pacific players, which I'm sure many of you will probably pick a few more Pacific players than you otherwise would. But the dilemma really stems from the fact that a lot of the top teams play against other pretty good teams, right? So Paper X are playing T1. Is there a world where T1, who have had loads of times to prepare, could beat Paper X? Yeah, I could see that happening, right? DRX play Gen G. RRQ play Gen G as well, right? So basically, there isn't, I think, a lot of teams that you can look at here and say, I know for sure they're going to win 2 games. And that is where the dilemma of this comes in, because yes, they are playing 2 games. However, if they lose one of those games 2-0, they're not going to get that many points from that game. Right? So at that point, you kind of wasted that opportunity, and there are other teams in other regions that you might say, oh, well, you know, there are other games that I like more, you know, that I can see. For instance, if we come to Americas here, you know, Cloud9 are playing Furia, right? Like, I feel very good that Cloud9 will beat Furia, and it probably will be 2-0, and the Cloud9 players will probably score pretty well, right? However, for others, that isn't necessarily the case, and this is really the dilemma, is how do you make that work? How many Pacific players do you actually go in on? Because here's the other thing. If you do load up, say, on 9 Pacific players, right, and have that as your full starting lineup for week 1, your week 1 score might be okay, but you then have to think about, well, you've only got 2 transfers, right? So again, if we come back to Pacific, you've only got 2 transfers, so that means you'd still have 7 Pacific players for week 2. So not only do you need to have ones that you feel good about in week 1, but for almost all of them, you also need to feel good about their week 2 as well, right? And now trying to find even more players of like, you know, well, I like some of their week 1 matchups, and do they have a good matchup in week 2 as well? That's going to be more difficult, right? Like, for instance, you might be a big Boom fan and think, oh yeah, I think Boom are going to beat Talon and T1, but then they play Paper Rex, so you might be like, oh, well, am I going to keep them for that? I don't know. And that is where this is getting pretty interesting, I think, for Stage 2, because of course, we know it's not like Toronto, where we don't know who will play who in the next stages and all of that. We know who everyone's going to play, and so in general, you can just look at, like, the groups and be like, well, just pick teams from groups that you like, right? For instance, you might look at, you know, Americas here, and I personally would say that Group Omega is probably a group that, at least for the start of the group stage, I'm going to avoid. Because I have no idea who's going to win these games between these teams. I think it's extremely tough to call almost every single game, right? Whereas in Group Alpha, you know, there might be a team like Cloud9, for instance, that I quite like, right? As a kind of a mid-level team, but has, you know, games against 2G and Furia and maybe EG that they'll all be favored for. And then they're also playing a G2 who has nothing to play for and might be playing with without Leaf as well, right? So, you know, I might look at a team like that and think, I like going in for a team like that. And so let's continue doing that for the other regions as well, and kind of taking a more holistic approach of this, not just getting super focused on week 1. If we do look at Pacific and their groups in general of teams that you might want to target, I would say in general that Group Omega for teams like Paper X, if you believe in T1 or Talon or Zeta or Boom, whichever of these other teams, probably other than Paper X, that you believe in, you know, I think that this is a pretty favorable group, or more favorable than, say, you know, picking from a Nongshim Secret global standpoint. But even for Gen G and DRX and RRQ, you know, if one of those teams loses to the other top teams in this group, you know, that's not great either if your team is only going 3-2 and maybe is losing 2-0 to both of the other big teams. And then in EMEA, when we take a look at the groups, personally, again, I think that Group Alpha, yes, Heretics, you know, are probably going to be pretty good, but I think that this is a tougher group to call. Again, I think a lot of these teams, you know, on paper could be decent, right? And could be a bit of a threat. Whereas Omega, I feel a bit better about, you know, maybe your Fanatics and Liquids kind of coming out on top of this group and basically being like, you know, should be the favorites to kind of win probably the 4 games. The Carmine Core game might be the hardest one for them, but I do, you know, trust these 2 to probably at least be able to beat the other 4 teams. So in general, what I would say is that you do want to have more Pacific players than you otherwise would have been going for, right? That just makes sense because they are going to play 2 games. The Pacific players will almost certainly be the highest scoring players. Your IGL should be a Pacific player in this first week, almost certainly, right? But I don't think you need to go all in, right? You don't have to have 9 Pacific players. In fact, I actually think, you know, dialing that back a bit and maybe going for like 6, 7 is actually probably optimal, because you just don't know who's going to win all these games. And of course, then you do need to start getting rid of some Pacific players because they don't play in week 5, right? They don't have a week 5. So you are going to have to start getting rid of some of those Pacific players, and that might not be easy either. My personal opinion on this is that I'm probably going to go in for Gen G. The reason I'm going to go in for Gen G is not just because I think, you know, they're going to win these games, because I think Gen G are a very good team, even though they're playing 2 very tough games in DRX and RRQ. Let me explain why I think that Gen G are still good picks. One reason is I would be very surprised if they lost 2-0 in these games, right? I think Gen G are good enough to at least win a map in these games, which will at least give them some points. Even if they lost both of these games to DRX and RRQ, I would still expect the players to get a decent level of points. And then Gen G, for the rest of the stage, they play Global, Secret, and Nongshim. 3 games that I would expect them to win, even if they started 0-2. Right? So I think that Gen G, in a weird way, are kind of a safe bet. Because not only are they playing 2 games, and they might win those games because they're a good team, but also they are playing those games, and then after this week, I don't feel like I need to get rid of them. Right? I'll feel happy with having Gen G players the rest of the way. The same, I think, is true for Paper Rex. Obviously, just because they're Paper Rex, yeah, they could lose to T1. I think that they will beat DFM, but then they're going to be favored for every other game, you know, the rest of the stage as well. Right? So, me personally, I'm probably going to go in on Paper Rex and Gen G. But again, if you like some other team here, and you think, hey, that's a team that I really believe in, then absolutely go for it. But again, you need to be thinking of the Pacific players that you choose. You got to know, you got to look beyond week 1, essentially, because you're going to be able to get rid of some of them, but not all of them. And so you need to be thinking about, well, I you know, like this team for week 1, but then not so much. I can get rid of them, but this team I need to stick with for the rest of the stage to feel good about picking these specific players.